Ascii here for Nerf TV, welcome you back to Hearthstone with another deck guide. Today we're taking a look at my Spell Power Mage deck. It's possible to build a variation with only basic cards, but in the deck I'm going to be showing you today we have 6 cards that come from packs. If you have a very extensive section of cards, many of these can be upgraded, and many of them are fairly cheap to unlock and get even if you are new to Hearthstone. But as I say, I will go point all these out as we go through the list, and then you can change them out where you see fit. So, first of all, Arcane Missiles deal 3 damage split randomly among enemy characters for 1 mana. We have 2 of these in the deck. It's a little bit RNG, but it can be quite useful early game for removing minions off the field or just dishing out some general damage. Not the most powerful card in the world, but definitely one to take in the deck. Next up is our very first card that comes from packs. We have 2 Ice Lances. This will freeze a character if it's just normal, and if the character is frozen it will deal 4 damage instead. So fairly useful just for the freezing itself. It's only 1 mana cost, so if they've got a creature out in the field that you just can't deal with this turn, you can freeze it and it buys you a turn without that card being able to attack you, so it can be very useful just for that by itself. However, if you can couple up with Frostbolt, a card we're going to get to a little bit later, you can deal some serious damage. Now Frostbolt will deal 3 damage to the enemy character and freeze it, and then Ice Lance will deal a further 4 damage on top of that, and we're only talking 3 mana cost for both those cards to be cast. If you've got some spell power out on the board, you're then talking 9 damage, 11 damage, some seriously strong combination there, and a very low mana cost for your actual turn in its entirety. So we have 2 of those in the deck. It's not something that is basic, but it's definitely worth unlocking. It's fairly cheap to craft. Next up we have 2 mirror images. This summons a 2/0/2 minions with taunt. A good way to protect your spell power minions. Most of them aren't that powerful, so it's a good way to keep them guarded, and it's also a good way to buy yourself a turn and stop yourself from taking any damage. A number of uses for that card, and I find it really effective and helpful. Mana Worm, this is another one that comes from packs. Whenever you cast a spell you gain +1 attack. Now this is something I personally am planning on changing out in the future for another Pyroblast, but for the time being I'm keeping it in there for an early game strong minion. You can play it quite early. It's quite hard for them to remove too early on because it's got 3 HP, so there's not many creatures that can get rid of it until maybe turn 3 when a Raptor or something like that could attack, but in general it's a fairly strong card and buffs up quite quickly. Arcane Explosion, this deals 1 damage to all enemy minions. By itself, not all that great, but like we said, this is a spell power deck. We're going to have a lot of spell power out in the field. You're talking at least 1 or 2 per turn at any one time, so you can deal some serious damage. If you've got 2 spell power minions out in the field, you're talking 3 damage to each enemy minion, and that can be nearly 9, 12 damage, something like that, for only 2 mana costs, so it can be very useful. We spoke about Frostbolt a moment ago, a fantastic card and definitely a must-have in the deck. Next up, the Kobold Geomancer. This is a 2/2 for 2 and you get +1 spell power. Not the greatest values in the world, but you need it for the spell power, so definitely a must-have card. Sorcerers Apprentice, one of my favourite cards for the mage. Your spells cost 1 less. This is one of the ones you have to unlock from packs, and it's definitely something I would very highly recommend. Stat wise it's a 3/2, so you're talking the same sort of stats as a Bloodfen Raptor or something like that, but you're also getting this reduced cost to your spells. So useful because in the later game you can start actually comboing out many different spells almost for free. You can cast Arcane Missiles for free, you can cast Ice Lance for free, Mirror Image for free. Really useful, and you can get some serious value out of that card, and if you can play 2 of them out in the field at once, you're talking some real potential for dishing out some very fast and very difficult damage for them to deal with. Next up, Arcane Intellect. Draw 2 cards for 3 mana cost. This card is interesting. You're basically trading 3 mana and a card for 2 cards, so you're basically getting 1 more card for the cost of the 3 mana. Now that doesn't seem that great, but if it draws, say you've got spell power out in the field already and you draw into 2 spells, say an Ice Lance and a Frostbolt, fantastic, it's worked out brilliantly well for you. So definitely something I would recommend taking. There is many times it will just save your life and be really useful. Another spell power minion here, the Ogre Mage. Quite hard for them to remove. It's got 4 HP, but it's only got 1 damage. It was nerfed quite recently to reduce its damage output, so it's not very good at round turn 3, 4, 5 for actually killing anything, but it's fairly difficult for them to remove it off the field at that point, so you can get some spell damage that lasts for a little bit longer. Next up, Firebolt deals 6 damage. Fairly basic, great for removal, great for hitting the enemy character. Buffs up obviously with your spell power for some real high stacking damage, and only 4 cost, it can be great value. Ogre Mage, another spell power minion, 4/4/4, so fairly reasonable values, not fantastic but okay, and you get the increased spell damage from that one as well. The Senjin Shieldmaster, this is something you can certainly trade out if you find something more useful. I quite like it because I feel around turn 4 I like to have something that I can play if I'm in a bad position. If I haven't got good draw so far, it's nice to have a taunt in that you can just put out and it's quite hard for them to remove. The Shieldmaster is very good value. With 5 HP it's very difficult to remove around turn 4 or 5 unless they're actually going to use a spell or something to remove it directly. Then we jump up. We have no 5 cost minions at all in this deck, and that is a slight weakness, but we jump straight up to the Archmage. It's a 4/7 with +1 spell damage, very difficult to remove. Not that much damage in itself, but because it stays around the field for quite a while, you can definitely get some good value out of that increased spell damage. Flame Strike is our next card, deal 4 damage to all enemy minions. A great board wipe, especially like we said before so many times, this is a spell power deck. You're going to be talking maybe 5 or 6 damage across all enemy minions, so some seriously good value. So it gives you different options. You've got Arcane Explosion for clearing away weaker minions with perhaps 2 or 3 damage coming out of that, and Flame Strike for getting rid of really high value minions in the later game where you're talking about 5 or 6 potential damage. The final card we're going to look at is Pyroblast, and this is also our last card that came from a pack. Deal 10 damage. It's pretty much a must have once you unlock this card. Before then, don't worry too much about it, but once you get it, definitely put it in. It's very strong. It can definitely be a game changer, or it can be the victory card that just wins you the match. If you top deck into that on turn 8, you're pretty much set. I mean, it's so strong, especially if you've got some spell power out on the field. So let's jump quickly into crafting mode and have a look at a few cards that could be useful if you feel you need them in your deck. So first up is Cone of Cold and Blizzard. Both these cards give some AoE freeze and deal a little bit of damage. They can be useful if you feel you need a little bit more control within your deck. I personally won't be using them, but they definitely have some value and I've seen people use them quite effectively. Mana Addict is another card I personally won't be using, but definitely has some synergy. Whenever you cast a spell, gain 2 attack this turn, and you can get some seriously powerful combinations out of that if you can ram out quite a lot of spells very quickly. So definitely some potential there if you want to follow down that kind of line. Next up is page 11. Let's jump forward where we have the Ancient Mage. Battle Cry gives adjacent minions +1 spell damage. Obviously this means you can get 2 spell damage out of a single card for only 4 mana cost, so really good value there if you have the minions out in the field to buff up. I don't feel this deck has enough minions out on the field at any one time to get value out of that. Normally they're getting removed too quickly. The enemy's still fighting back, of course. You are going to be losing minions on the field, and I don't feel you can actually get that spell damage buff onto 2 minions at one time. Obviously if you can only get it onto 1, it's still not terrible. I mean, you're still getting more spell damage out in the field, but to get the real value out of the card you need to have 2 minions on the field already when you play that one, and I don't find that to be particularly easy. Next up is the Azure Drake, a great card to put into this deck and certainly something I will be putting in the future. +1 spell damage, and it also gives you a battle cry to draw a card. Now, talking of card draw, that is something this deck does definitely lack. I've seen some people will play very similar decks and have put a few cards in there to get a little bit more card draw and keep up higher numbers of cards in their hands, and it does work out very effectively. So if you are playing a basic deck, perhaps think about putting some stuff in like the Novice Engineer as an option. It's up to you, but it can definitely get some good value out of those cards. The Violet Teacher also has some synergy with this sort of deck. It's not particularly useful as you can't really capitalise on having those minions on the field. You've got no way to buff them up and make them stronger, and they're just basically cannon fodder, but there's certainly some synergy and you could play it through that if you wanted to. The final card we're going to be taking a look at is this one here, which has spell damage +5, so a massive amount of spell damage there. With 12 HP, it's pretty hard to remove from the field as well. However, to keep in mind that you won't be able to actually cast very many spells at the same time as playing this card, as it is 9 mana cost, so you have to wait to the following turn to capitalise on it. So if they are able to remove it or use any kind of hex or polymorph or something like that to get rid of this card, that can be a massive problem, and you basically wasted an entire turn on getting filling that one out, and sometimes it can be better just to go and cast the spells and get multiple minions out in the field and buff your spell damage up at a smaller amount, but have more options and more minions on the field to play around with. So go try this deck out and let us know what you think of it in the comments below. I've been Ascii, you've been watching Nerf TV, thanks for watching.